Sarah Martinez never imagined that a routine equipment replacement would change everything she thought she knew about respect, recognition, and her place in the Navy. At 24, she had spent 3 years as a communications technician second class, working behind the scenes to keep the naval base's communication systems running smoothly. Her days were filled with circuit boards, antenna alignments, and endless diagnostic tests that most people found mind-numbingly boring. But Sarah loved the precision required, the way every connection had to be perfect, every signal clear and strong. The morning started like any other at Naval Base Coronado. Sarah arrived at the communications building at 0600, her toolbox in one hand and work orders in the other. The California sun was just beginning to cast long shadows across the base, and she could hear the distant sound of helicopter rotors from the Special Operations Command compound nearby. She had always wondered what went on behind those restricted fences, but her security clearance only extended to the communications equipment she maintained. Her supervisor, Chief Petty Officer Williams, handed her a priority work order that made her pause. The job was simple enough. Replace aging communication gear in Building 147, a nondescript structure she had never worked in before. What caught her attention was the security classification stamp and the note that all work had to be completed during daylight hours, with an escort present at all times. "Chief, what's special about Building 147? Sarah asked, studying the paperwork more carefully. She noticed the building designation included letters and numbers she didn't recognize from the standard base directory. Chief Williams looked up from his coffee, his weathered face showing the kind of expression that suggested he knew more than he was saying. "Just do the job, Martinez. Replace the gear, test the systems, and don't ask questions about what you see or who you might run into. Some buildings on this base operate on a need-to-know basis, and technicians like us just need to know how to fix the equipment." The escort turned out to be a young Marine corporal named Davidson, who looked like he had been briefed to say as little as possible. As they walked across the base toward Building 147, Sarah noticed they were heading into a section she rarely visited. The buildings here looked different, more modern with fewer windows and more security cameras. Personnel moved with a different kind of purpose, and she noticed that many of them wore insignia she didn't immediately recognize. Building 147 itself was unremarkable from the outside, but the moment Corporal Davidson badged them in, Sarah realized this was unlike any facility she had worked in before. The interior was a maze of corridors lined with offices and briefing rooms. The walls displayed photographs of naval operations she recognized from news reports, successful missions in dangerous parts of the world where American forces had made a difference. What struck her most was the quiet intensity of the place. People spoke in hushed tones, moved with deliberate efficiency, and seemed to carry themselves with an extra measure of confidence. The communication equipment she needed to replace was located in a technical room on the second floor. As Davidson led her through the building, she caught glimpses of men and women who looked different from the typical sailors and officers she worked with daily. They were fitter, more alert, and carried themselves with a kind of quiet confidence that suggested they had seen and done things most people could never imagine. Their uniforms bore the same Navy markings she knew, but there were subtle differences: special warfare pins, deployment patches from exotic locations, and a way of moving that suggested they were always ready for action. Sarah set up her equipment and began the methodical process of replacing the communication gear. The work was more complex than her usual assignments. These systems were designed for reliability under extreme conditions, with redundant circuits and encryption capabilities far beyond what she typically encountered. Each component had to be tested multiple times, and the documentation requirements were extensive. It was clear that communication failures in this building could have serious consequences. As she worked, she became aware that the building's normal activities continued around her. She could hear briefings in nearby rooms, the sound of equipment being moved, and occasional bursts of intense conversation that immediately quieted when doors opened. Through the windows, she could see training areas where small groups of personnel practiced with equipment she didn't recognize. Everything about the place suggested it was home to people who operated at the highest levels of military capability. The most striking thing about her time in Building 147 was how the personnel treated her. Unlike some facilities where technicians were barely acknowledged, everyone here was professional and courteous. When she needed to test communication lines that ran through occupied offices, Officers would immediately clear space for her to work and ask if she needed anything to complete her job effectively. There was no sense of impatience or irritation at having their work interrupted by maintenance activities. During her lunch break, Corporal Davidson led her to a small break room where she could eat the sandwich she had brought from home. As she sat alone reviewing her progress notes, she overheard a conversation between two officers discussing an upcoming training exercise. The details were technical: radio frequencies, communication protocols, and backup procedures in case primary systems failed. What impressed her was the level of planning that went into ensuring reliable communication under what sounded like challenging conditions. By late afternoon, Sarah had completed most of the equipment replacement and was beginning the final testing procedures. Each system had to be verified not just for basic functionality, but for performance under various stress conditions. The testing protocols were unlike anything in her standard manual. They simulated communication requirements during high-stress situations where failure could mean the difference between mission, success, and disaster. As the day wore on, she began to understand that Building 147 was home to some of the Navy's most elite personnel. The clues were everywhere: the specialized equipment, the intense focus on reliability and redundancy, the way everyone carried themselves with quiet confidence. She realized she was working in a facility that supported operations most people would never hear about. Conducted by sailors whose names would never appear in newspapers, the work was challenging but satisfying. Every connection she made, every circuit she tested was contributing to the capability of people who operated at the highest levels of military service. As she packed up her equipment at the end of the day, Sarah felt a sense of pride in her work that went beyond the usual satisfaction of completing a technical assignment. She had contributed to something important, even if she would never know exactly what that something was. The second day at Building 147 brought unexpected complications that would test Sarah's technical skills and introduce her to aspects of military life she had never encountered. She arrived to find Chief Williams waiting with additional work orders and a concerned expression that immediately put her on alert. "Martinez, we've got problems with the systems you installed yesterday," he said, handing her a thick folder of diagnostic reports. "The overnight testing revealed intermittent signal degradation that wasn't showing up during your standard tests. Whatever's causing it needs to be fixed today because they have a major exercise starting tomorrow morning." Sarah studied the diagnostic data as Corporal Davidson led her back to Building 147. The ICO signal loss patterns were unusual. They appeared random but occurred at regular intervals, suggesting either a timing issue with the new equipment or interference from an external source. This kind of problem required detective work, systematically eliminating possibilities until the root cause became clear. The technical room was busier today. Several personnel were conducting equipment checks and system verifications in preparation for what was clearly an important operation. Sarah set up her diagnostic equipment carefully, trying not to interfere with the other activities while gaining access to the systems she needed to troubleshoot. As she worked, she became aware of the intense preparation taking place throughout the building. Teams of personnel moved through the corridors with purpose, carrying specialized gear and discussing plans in the kind of shorthand that develops among people who have worked together in high-pressure situations. The atmosphere was focused and professional, but she could sense an undercurrent of anticipation that suggested something significant was about to happen. The signal degradation problem proved elusive. Sarah tested every connection, verified every component, and ran diagnostic routines that should have identified any hardware issues. The equipment she had installed was functioning perfectly according to all standard measurements. Yet the intermittent signal loss continued to appear in the overnight testing logs. It was the kind of problem that could drive a technician crazy. Everything looked right, but something was definitely wrong. By mid-morning, Sarah realized she needed help. The building's communication requirements were more complex than anything she had encountered before, and the intermittent nature of the problem suggested it might be related to how the new equipment interacted with existing systems during peak usage periods. She needed someone with deeper knowledge of the facility's overall communication architecture. Corporal Davidson made some calls and returned with news that surprised her. A Navy lieutenant who served as the building's communication systems officer would be available to assist her in the afternoon. This was unusual. Officers rarely got involved in routine maintenance issues, but the importance of reliable communication for tomorrow's exercise apparently justified the exception. Lieutenant James Morrison arrived at 1400 hours, and Sarah immediately understood why he had been assigned to help with her problem. Unlike most officers she had worked with, Morrison clearly had extensive hands-on technical experience. He examined her diagnostic data with the practiced eye of someone who understood both the theoretical principles and practical realities of complex communication systems. The signal loss is happening during simulated high-traffic periods, Morrison observed, pointing to specific entries in the diagnostic logs. Your equipment is fine, but it's not playing well with our load balancing protocols. We're going to need to adjust the timing parameters and probably modify some of the interface configurations. Working with Lieutenant Morrison was unlike any collaboration Sarah had experienced in her Navy career. He treated her as a technical expert, rather than simply someone following orders, asking for her opinion on various approaches and explaining the reasoning behind his suggestions. Together, they traced signal paths through the building's communication infrastructure, identifying points where the new equipment needed to be integrated more carefully with existing systems. The work required them to access technical spaces throughout Building 147, giving Sarah a broader view of the facility's capabilities. She saw equipment rooms filled with communication gear that was far more sophisticated than anything on the rest of the base. Radio systems that could operate across multiple frequency bands simultaneously, satellite communication terminals with capabilities she had only read about in technical manuals, and computer systems designed for rapid, secure data transmission under challenging conditions. What impressed her most was Lieutenant Morrison's approach to problem solving. Rather than simply issuing orders, he explained the technical requirements they were trying to meet and asked for her input on how to achieve them. He clearly respected her expertise and was genuinely interested in her perspective on the technical challenges they faced. As they worked together, Sarah learned more about the demands placed on communication systems in Building 147. The equipment had to function reliably under conditions that would challenge even the most robust civilian systems. Communication might be required from remote locations with limited power, in environments with significant electromagnetic interference, or during situations where equipment failure could have serious consequences for personnel safety. The people who work in this building operate in challenging environments, Morrison explained as they tested a modified configuration. When they're in the field, they need to know that their communication equipment will work perfectly every time. There's no room for intermittent problems or unexplained signal degradation. The afternoon's work revealed the root cause of the signal loss problem. The new equipment was designed for different timing protocols than the existing systems, and during high traffic periods, this mismatch created brief windows where signals were not properly synchronized. The solution required modifying software parameters on both the new and existing equipment to ensure perfect compatibility. By 1700 hours, Sarah and Lieutenant Morrison had resolved the communication issues and verified that all systems were operating perfectly under all test conditions. The work had been challenging and educational, requiring her to think about communication systems in ways she had never considered before. More importantly, it had shown her a different model of military leadership, one based on technical competence and collaborative problem-solving rather than simple hierarchy. As they packed up their equipment, Lieutenant Morrison thanked her for her technical expertise and professional approach to the problem. "Your attention to detail and systematic troubleshooting made all the difference," he said. "The people who depend on these communication systems will be safer because of the work you did today." The compliment meant more to Sarah than she expected. Throughout her Navy career, she had rarely received direct feedback from officers, and when she did, it was usually limited to brief acknowledgments of completed work. Morrison's recognition of her technical contributions felt different. It suggested that her skills were valued and that her work made a real difference in important operations. Walking back across the base with Corporal Davidson, Sarah reflected on the day's experiences. Working in Building 147 had shown her aspects of Navy operations she had never seen before, and collaborating with Lieutenant Morrison had demonstrated a style of military leadership that inspired rather than simply commanded. For the first time in her career, she felt like her technical expertise was truly appreciated. and that her contributions were making a difference in something important. The third morning brought an atmosphere of controlled intensity to Building 147 that Sarah could feel the moment she walked through the entrance. Today was the beginning of the major exercise that had driven the urgency of her communication system repairs, and the entire facility buzzed with focused activity. Personnel moved with purpose through the corridors, carrying specialized equipment and speaking in the clipped, efficient tones that characterized military operations when stakes were high. Sarah's assignment for the day was ostensibly simple: conduct final verification tests on all communication systems to ensure they would perform flawlessly during the exercise. However, as Corporal Davidson led her through the building, she quickly realized that simple had a different meaning in this environment. The testing protocols were exhaustive, requiring verification of system performance under conditions that simulated the most demanding operational scenarios. Lieutenant Morrison met them at the communication center, a room Sarah had not previously accessed that served as the nerve center for the building's information flow. Banks of monitors displayed communication networks, system status indicators, and real-time data feeds from various sources. The sophistication of the setup was impressive. This was clearly where personnel monitored and coordinated communication activities that extended far beyond the base itself. Today's exercise will stress our communication systems in ways that routine operations never do, Morrison explained as he showed Sarah the testing requirements. We need multiple redundant channels operating simultaneously, encrypted data transmission at maximum capacity, and perfect reliability for personnel who will be operating in challenging environments. Your job is to verify that every component you installed will perform perfectly under these conditions. The testing process was unlike anything Sarah had experienced in her Navy career. Rather than simply running standard diagnostic routines, she was required to simulate communication scenarios that pushed the equipment to its operational limits. This meant testing signal strength and clarity under simulated interference conditions, verifying data transmission rates during peak usage periods, and ensuring that backup systems would activate seamlessly if primary channels failed. As she worked, Sarah became increasingly aware of the exercise preparations taking place throughout Building 147. Teams of personnel conducted final equipment checks, reviewed operation plans, and coordinated with what were clearly external units located elsewhere. The level of planning and attention to detail was extraordinary. Every aspect of the operation appeared to have been considered and prepared for extensively. What struck her most was the calm professionalism of everyone involved. Despite the obvious complexity and importance of the exercise, there was no sense of panic or rushed activity. Personnel moved deliberately, communicated clearly, and approached their preparations with the confidence of people who had trained extensively for exactly these situations. It was clear that this was not their first major operation, and their experience showed in every aspect of their preparation. Lieutenant Morrison remained available to answer Sarah's technical questions and explain the operational requirements behind various system configurations. Through their conversations, she began to understand that the exercise involved coordinated activities between multiple units, some of which were located considerable distances from the base. Reliable communication was essential not just for operational success, but for the safety of personnel who would be operating in environments where equipment failure could have serious consequences. The most challenging aspect of the testing was simulating worst-case scenarios. Sarah had to verify that communication systems would continue functioning, even if multiple components failed simultaneously, that encrypted transmissions would remain secure under electronic warfare conditions, and that personnel using the equipment under stress would find all systems responsive and intuitive. These requirements pushed her technical knowledge to its limits and required her to think about equipment performance in ways she had never considered. During a brief break, Sarah observed the final briefing sessions taking place in adjacent rooms. Through partially open doors, she could see detailed presentations covering operational objectives, contingency plans, and communication protocols. The personnel attending these briefings had an intensity of focus that suggested they understood the importance of the exercise and their individual roles in its success. What impressed her most was the emphasis placed on communication reliability. Multiple speakers stressed the critical importance of maintaining contact between various units. The procedures for dealing with communication failures and the backup systems available if primary channels were compromised. It was clear that in their world, communication was not just helpful, it was essential for mission success and personnel safety. By afternoon, Sarah had completed all required testing and verified that every communication system was operating at peak performance. The work had been demanding but rewarding, requiring her to understand not just how the equipment functioned, but why perfect performance was so critical for the people who depended on it. She had gained a deeper appreciation for the role that reliable communication played in complex military operations. As the day concluded, Lieutenant Morrison reviewed her test results and expressed satisfaction with the system performance she had achieved. "Your work has given us complete confidence in our communication capabilities," he said. "The personnel participating in this exercise will know that they can depend on their equipment to perform exactly as expected, regardless of the conditions they encounter." The compliment carried special weight because Sarah could see how seriously everyone in Building 147 took their responsibilities. These were people who operated at the highest levels of military capability, and their confidence in her technical work represented recognition from peers she had come to respect deeply. Walking back to her quarters that evening, Sarah reflected on how much her perspective had changed during her 3 days in Building 147. She had always taken pride in her technical skills, but working with the personnel in this facility had shown her how her expertise contributed to something much larger and more important than routine equipment maintenance. The communication systems she installed and tested were critical components in operations that made a real difference in the world. More importantly, she had experienced a different model of military service, one where technical expertise was valued, individual contributions were recognized, and personnel were treated as essential members of a team rather than simply people following orders. The professionalism and mutual respect she had observed in Building 147 represented the kind of military service she had hoped to find when she enlisted. As she prepared for what she assumed would be her final day of work in the building, Sarah felt a sense of accomplishment that went beyond the satisfaction of completing a challenging technical assignment. She had contributed to the capability of people who operated at the highest levels of military service, and their confidence in her work represented the kind of recognition she had always hoped to earn in her Navy career. The fourth day at Building 147 was supposed to be routine, a final systems check to ensure everything remained operational during the ongoing exercise. Sarah arrived expecting to spend a few hours running diagnostic tests before returning to her regular duties at the main communications facility. Instead, she found herself thrust into a situation that would test not only her technical skills but her ability to perform under pressure alongside some of the Navy's most elite personnel. Chief Williams met her at the entrance with an expression she had never seen before, a mixture of concern and urgent purpose that immediately put her on alert. "Martinez, there's been a development with the exercise. They need you inside immediately, and this isn't routine maintenance anymore. Lieutenant Morrison specifically requested you because of your familiarity with the systems you installed." Corporal Davidson led her quickly through corridors that were noticeably busier than previous days. Personnel moved with increased urgency, and she could hear intense conversations taking place behind closed doors. The atmosphere had shifted from the controlled preparation of previous days to the focused intensity of an operation in progress. Something significant was happening, and her technical expertise was apparently needed to keep it happening successfully. Lieutenant Morrison met them at the communications center, which had been transformed into an active command hub. Multiple workstations were occupied by personnel monitoring various communication networks, and large displays showed information that Sarah couldn't fully interpret, but recognized as operational data. The professional calm of previous days remained, but it now carried an undercurrent of heightened awareness that suggested real-world consequences hung in the balance. "We've got a communication problem that's threatening the entire exercise," Morrison explained without preamble. "One of our remote units is experiencing intermittent signal loss that's preventing them from maintaining reliable contact. The problem appears to be related to equipment interaction issues similar to what we solved earlier this week, but it's manifesting under field conditions we can't fully replicate here." Sarah studied the diagnostic data Morrison provided, recognizing patterns similar to the problems she had resolved during her earlier work in the building. However, the remote location created complications she had never dealt with before. She couldn't simply go to the problematic equipment and run hands-on diagnostics. Everything had to be accomplished through remote testing and guided troubleshooting procedures. The unit experiencing problems is operating in a challenging environment with limited power and significant electromagnetic interference. Morrison continued. They need reliable communication not just for the exercise but for safety reasons. If we can't solve this problem quickly, they may have to abort their portion of the operation, which would compromise the entire training scenario. The technical challenge was unlike anything Sarah had encountered in her Navy career. She had to diagnose equipment problems based on incomplete information, transmitted through unreliable communication channels, then develop solutions that could be implemented by personnel who were operating under field conditions with limited technical resources. Every diagnostic test had to be carefully planned because communication windows were brief and unpredictable. Working alongside Lieutenant Morrison and the Communication Center personnel, Sarah began a systematic troubleshooting process that pushed her technical knowledge to its limits. She analyzed signal patterns transmitted from the remote location, compared them with baseline performance data from her earlier testing, and developed theories about what might be causing the intermittent failures under field conditions. The most challenging aspect was communicating with the personnel at the remote location. They were clearly skilled operators, but their primary expertise was in areas other than communication system troubleshooting. Sarah had to develop diagnostic procedures that could be implemented by people who understood equipment operation but not necessarily the technical details of signal processing and system integration. As the morning progressed, Sarah found herself increasingly integrated into the operations command structure. Personnel who she now realized held senior positions regularly consulted with her about communication capabilities and limitations. Her technical assessments were being used to make operational decisions about how to proceed with the exercise while maintaining safety margins for the remote. The breakthrough came when Sarah realized that the intermittent signal loss was occurring during specific types of data transmission that placed unusual demands on the communication equipment. The remote location's challenging electromagnetic environment was amplifying timing issues that remained undetectable under normal conditions but became critical during peak usage. I think I can solve this, Sarah told Morrison after reviewing the latest diagnostic data. But it's going to require real-time parameter adjustments coordinated with their communication attempts. I need to be able to monitor their signals continuously and make system modifications based on what I'm seeing. Morrison immediately arranged for Sarah to have direct access to the primary communication monitoring station, where she could observe signal quality in real time and coordinate with the remote unit to implement systematic modifications to their equipment configuration. This level of operational integration was unprecedented. In her experience, she was now a critical component in ensuring the success of an operation involving personnel she was beginning to understand were among the Navy's most elite forces. The solution required several hours of careful coordination between Sarah, the Communication Center personnel, and the remote unit. Each modification had to be tested under actual field conditions, with results transmitted back through the problematic communication channel she was trying to fix. It was a delicate process that required patience, precision, and complete focus on technical details. By late afternoon, Sarah had successfully resolved the communication problems, and reliable contact was restored with the remote unit. The solution involved a combination of timing adjustments, signal processing modifications, and operational procedure changes that addressed the unique challenges of their field environment. More importantly, the fix was robust enough to maintain reliability even as conditions changed throughout the remainder of the exercise. The moment when clear, strong communication was re-established with the remote unit brought a palpable sense of relief to everyone in the command center. Sarah watched as operational updates resumed flowing smoothly. Personnel coordination returned to normal patterns, and the exercise continued according to plan. Her technical expertise had directly contributed to the success of an operation involving some of the military's most capable personnel. Lieutenant Morrison's gratitude was immediate and genuine. "Your problem-solving skills and technical expertise saved this entire operation," he said. The personnel at that remote location depend on reliable communication for their safety and mission success. What you accomplished today made a real difference in something that matters. As the day concluded, Sarah realized that her role had evolved far beyond routine equipment maintenance. She had become an integral part of ensuring the success of operations conducted by personnel who operated at the highest levels of military capability. Her technical skills were not just appreciated, they were essential for enabling the kind of complex, challenging missions that these elite forces regularly undertook. The experience had shown her a level of military service she had never imagined, one where technical excellence directly supported operations that made a real difference in the world. More importantly, it had demonstrated that her expertise was valued by people whose judgment she had come to respect deeply. The fifth day brought an unexpected summons that would change Sarah's understanding of her place in the Navy forever. Instead of reporting to Building 147 for routine post-exercise maintenance, she received orders to report to the base commander's office at 0900 hours. Chief Williams delivered the message with an expression that mixed pride and curiosity, clearly as puzzled by the unusual request as Sarah herself. "I've never seen a communications technician called to the command level," Williams admitted as he handed her the official summons. "Whatever happened in Building 147, it got someone's attention at levels way above my pay grade. Make sure your uniform is perfect, and remember that everything you did over there was classified." Sarah spent extra time preparing her uniform, ensuring every detail met the exacting standards expected for command-level meetings. As she walked across the base toward the administration building, she tried to imagine what might warrant such an unusual summons. Her work in Building 147 had been successful, but she couldn't understand why communication system repairs would require attention from senior leadership. The base commander's office was unlike any military workspace Sarah had ever entered. The walls displayed photographs of naval operations spanning decades, certificates and awards recognizing various achievements, and maps showing global naval deployments. Behind the commander's desk hung the American flag and Navy ensign, positioned to emphasize the gravity of decisions made in this room. Captain Rebecca Torres, the base commander, was a woman whose presence immediately commanded respect. Her uniform bore ribbons and badges indicating extensive operational experience, and her manner suggested someone accustomed to making decisions that affected thousands of personnel. When she gestured for Sarah to take a seat, her expression was serious but not unfriendly. "Petty Officer Martinez, I've received some unusual reports about your work this week," Captain Torres began, consulting a folder that Sarah assumed contained details about her activities in Building 147. "Lieutenant, Morrison has submitted a commendation request that describes technical expertise and operational integration that goes well beyond what we typically expect from communications maintenance personnel." Sarah listened carefully as Captain Torres outlined the reports she had received. Lieutenant Morrison had detailed not only her successful resolution of complex technical problems, but her ability to work effectively as part of an operational team during demanding circumstances. The commendation described her contribution as essential to the success of training exercises involving some of the base's most elite units. What surprised Sarah most was learning that her work had been observed and evaluated by personnel whose names she didn't recognize but whose positions clearly carried significant authority. Apparently, her technical problem-solving and professional behavior during the communication crisis had impressed people who made decisions about military careers and assignments. The personnel in Building 147 operate under unique requirements, Captain Torres continued. They need technical support from people who can maintain the highest security standards, work effectively under pressure, and integrate seamlessly into operational environments where reliability is essential. Based on the reports I've received, you demonstrated all of these capabilities during your assignment there. Captain Torres opened another folder and spread several documents across her desk. Sarah recognized official Navy forms but couldn't immediately identify their specific purpose. The captain's expression became more businesslike as she began explaining options Sarah had never considered. "I'm offering you an opportunity that doesn't come along often for personnel at your level," Torres said. "The Special Operations Command has requested that you be considered for permanent assignment to their communication support team. This would involve additional training, higher security clearance, and integration into operational units that conduct missions most Navy personnel never hear about. The offer was stunning. Sarah had never imagined that her technical skills might qualify her for assignment to special operations units. Throughout her Navy career, she had focused on becoming the best communications technician possible. But she had always assumed that elite units had their own specialized personnel for technical support requirements. Captain Torres explained that modern special operations required technical expertise that extended far beyond traditional military specialties. Communication systems had become so sophisticated that maintaining them required personnel who understood both the technical requirements and the operational demands of elite military units. Sarah's demonstrated ability to work effectively under pressure while maintaining technical excellence had identified her as a candidate for this specialized role. This assignment would change your career trajectory significantly, Torres warned. The training is demanding, the operational tempo is high, and the security requirements are extensive. You would be supporting personnel who operate in challenging environments where equipment failure can have serious consequences. It's not a decision to make lightly. Sarah asked about the specific requirements and was briefed on training programs that would expand her technical expertise while teaching her to operate effectively in environments far removed from traditional base facilities. The assignment would involve deployment rotations, advanced technical certifications, and integration into units that conducted missions she could only imagine. The most appealing aspect was the opportunity to work alongside personnel whose competence and professionalism had impressed her deeply during her week in Building 147. The model of military service she had observed there, based on technical excellence, mutual respect, and shared commitment to mission success, represented everything she had hoped to find when she enlisted in the Navy. Captain Torres gave Sarah 48 hours to consider the offer and discuss it with family members who would be affected by her decision. The assignment would require extensive travel, deployment to locations she couldn't discuss with anyone outside the military, and integration into a community of personnel who operated under different standards than conventional Navy units. As Sarah left the commander's office, her mind raced with possibilities she had never considered. The opportunity represented recognition of her technical abilities at the highest levels and a chance to contribute to operations that made a real difference in the world. More importantly, it offered the kind of challenging, meaningful military service she had always hoped to find. Walking back across the base, Sarah reflected on how much her perspective had changed during 1 week of work in Building 147. She had discovered capabilities she didn't know she possessed, earned recognition from personnel she respected deeply, and been offered opportunities that could transform her military career. The routine equipment replacement assignment had become a gateway to possibilities she had never imagined. That evening, Sarah called her parents to discuss the opportunity without revealing any classified details. Their pride in her achievements was evident, and their confidence in her ability to succeed in challenging circumstances reinforced her own growing belief that she was ready for whatever demands this new assignment might bring. The decision would shape not only her military career but her understanding of how technical expertise could contribute to the kind of meaningful service she had always wanted to provide. For the first time since enlisting, Sarah felt that she had found her place in the Navy and the opportunity to make a real difference in something that mattered. Sarah's decision came during her final morning at Building 147, but the moment that sealed her choice arrived in a way she never could have anticipated. She had returned to complete the post-exercise system documentation, expecting routine paperwork and equipment verification. Instead, she found herself witness to a scene that would crystallize everything she had learned about respect, recognition, and what it meant to be valued for her contributions. Lieutenant Morrison was conducting the final equipment briefing with personnel who had participated in the exercise when Sarah arrived. As she set up her diagnostic equipment in the adjacent room, she could hear him describing how critical reliable communications had been to the operation's success. What caught her attention was his detailed explanation of how technical expertise had saved a potentially dangerous situation during the communication crisis. The remote unit's safety depended on maintaining reliable contact, Morrison was saying. When standard troubleshooting procedures failed, We had a communications technician who understood the systems well enough to diagnose problems under field conditions and implement solutions in real time. That kind of technical competence and operational integration is exactly what we need to support future missions. Sarah continued her work, but she couldn't help overhearing the discussion as Morrison outlined lessons learned from the exercise. He emphasized repeatedly how technical support personnel were essential members of the operational team, not just maintenance providers who worked behind the scenes. His respect for technical expertise and recognition of its importance to mission success reflected the collaborative approach she had experienced throughout her week in the building. The mornings, work proceeded routinely until Sarah encountered a minor issue with one of the backup communication systems. A connection had worked loose during the exercise, causing intermittent performance that wouldn't affect normal operations, but needed to be corrected before the equipment was returned to standby status. She was working on the repair when she heard footsteps approaching. Looking up from her work, Sarah saw Lieutenant Morrison accompanied by another officer she didn't recognize. The newcomer was clearly senior. His uniform bore the insignia of a Navy SEAL officer, and his bearing suggested someone accustomed to command responsibilities. What struck her immediately was the intensity of his attention, as Morrison explained the technical issue she was resolving. "This is Petty Officer Martinez," Morrison said by way of introduction. "She's the communications technician who solved our remote unit problems during the exercise. Sarah, this is Lieutenant Commander James Harrison, our operations officer." Lieutenant Commander Harrison studied her work with the practiced eye of someone who understood how equipment failures could affect operational success. He asked several technical questions about the repair she was making and the diagnostic procedures she had used to identify the problem. His questions were,